Today, we are going to have a session on Introduction to Technology Licensing by Dr. Ashley Stevens. Next slide, please. Dr. Ashley Stevens, he has been past President AUTM, Head of Technology Transfer for Boston University, President Focus IP Group, LLC. He is a biotech entrepreneur and technology commercialization expert. He co-founded GenMap and Kytogenetics, bringing academic innovations to market. He later led technology transfer at Dana-Farber Cancer Center and Boston University, where he helped launch 55 startups. He currently teaches commercialization at Osaka University. With this intro, I would request Dr. Stevens to kindly share his screen and start with his lecture for the day. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. One minor correction, I no longer teach at Osaka University. I did for 10 years, but I'm afraid that was one of the things that perished in the pandemic. So I'm going to talk to you today about technology licensing. Here's what I'm going to talk about. How do we transfer technology? Why do we license technology? I'll talk about the different types of licenses there are. We'll look at the anatomy of a license agreement. What does one of these things actually look like? I'll talk about how you extract value through a license agreement. And then I'll talk about some of the differences between licensing a technology and assigning the technology. So technology transfer is, I think, hopefully it forms a virtuous cycle. It starts with research. Now, scientists by and large are trained to do science. And this process of looking and trying to identify and then to capitalize on the commercial opportunities that may be generated by this research is a relatively new activity. So we need to start to educate our inventors and to outreach to them to start them thinking about this process. If we're successful, they'll start to think, oh yeah, well, you could use this to do that. And they'll send us a disclosure agreement. The first job of a tech transfer office is to evaluate that invention, to look at its commercial potential, its market opportunity, the likelihood of getting good patent protection, the likelihood of competition, the costs it's going to incur to develop it into something marketable. And based on that evaluation, we will select which of the inventions that are sent to us we will choose to protect. Now, in the US, we file initial patent applications on about half of the inventions we get. So there is a high degree of selectivity there. Now, at this point, you need to start to market your technology. There may be a few universities in the world, Harvard, MIT, Oxford, Cambridge, a few that people will go to their door and say, hey, I'm looking to do something in this space. What have you got? For the rest of us, we have to market our technology. And before we can do that, we're going to have to say, okay, what's this technology going to do? Is it a big invention? Is it a small invention? Are we going to license it to an existing company? Or is it something so radical that we're going to need a startup company to develop it? Once we've taken that decision and created the appropriate marketing materials, we can start marketing our technology. And hopefully some company somewhere will say, that looks pretty interesting. Let's talk some more. Now, Lisa Nelson, who ran tech transfer at MIT for 30 years, once very famously said, a hot academic technology is one that two companies are interested in. Academic technologies tend to be very early stage, and it takes time. I think we heard the figure yesterday perhaps 5 years for industry to catch up and begin to see where academic technologies can fit into their marketplace. But hopefully we'll get this expression of interest. And before we can start negotiating with the company that has expressed interest, we'll have to have an idea of what the value of the technology is and how we want to achieve that valuation. And I'll show you an example of the sort of terms we do later on. Hopefully, the negotiation is a successful one, and we finish up with a term sheet, a summary document that captures the key financial terms and commitment terms that the company and the inventing institution can agree on. And we may capture this with an option agreement, which I'll talk about later. We then take the term sheet and we start to include those provisions into a license agreement. And hopefully we finished up with a signed deal. At this point, the focus changes. Now, development is handed over to this company that has decided it wants to take the technology, and it has to do the product development. It needs to make reports to the inventing institution periodically on its progress, and perhaps it has to make some payments. So at this point, the academic institution needs to manage the license, make sure the company is adhering to the commitments that it agreed to and is honoring those obligations. Hopefully, their product development is successful and revenues will be generated, and some of those revenues will flow back to the inventing institution and can be reinvested in research. And this is what I mean by a virtuous cycle. So if you look, here is where the technology is actually transferred. So why do academic institutions license technology? Well, what is technology transfer? Academic institutions don't develop and sell products. It's not in our mission to develop and sell products. Most academic institutions, their mission is to teach the next generation of students and then to increase our sum total of knowledge by doing research. So we need to find a company to take our inventions that have promise and develop them. As I said earlier, it might be an existing company, a large company, a small company, or it may be a new company explicitly set up to develop the technology. In other words, a startup, also sometimes called a spin-out. And we then transfer the rights to the technology to them. So this is where we get the name technology transfer from. We transfer the rights to the technology from the institution that invented it to the company that is going to develop it. So how do we transfer the rights? There are two ways we can do this. We can assign the rights, in other words, sell the rights to them, or we can license the rights, which is kind of like renting the technology to them. What's the difference between these? Well, let's think of an analogy. You need somewhere to live. You find this nice complex. Some of your potential solutions, you can buy a condominium, as we call it in America, an apartment, a flat in this nice development, or you can rent an apartment in that nice development, or of course, you live in your parents' basement. Let's think about the implications of if you buy a place to live. It's yours forever. Previous owner has no further rights. Now, you get the benefit of it, but you also get the problems. The problems are yours. You've paid for the building upfront, but perhaps you've got a mortgage and have ongoing payment obligations to a bank. you can decide what to do with this building. You can live in it. You can rent it out. You can rent out part of it. You can sell it. You can demolish it, build something better. It's yours. You have complete freedom over what to do with it. Now let's think about the implications of if you rent a place to live. You have the right to live there for the duration of the lease, and as long as you pay the rent, and as long as you obey any other rules the landlord imposes that you agreed to when you signed the lease. Perhaps the limitations on having noisy parties at the weekends and at night. Maybe you have to cut the grass. Maybe you have to take out the trash, and so forth. The landlord has to fix the problems. And of course, the landlord still has rights. He owns it. He can decide whether to renew the lease. She can inspect it periodically to ensure that you're obeying the rules that you've agreed to. You might rent a place from Airbnb. You just rent a room, which is equivalent to licensing part of the rights, perhaps by a field of use or by a territory. And of course, if you live in your parents' basement, you have failure to launch. The best practice in tech transfer, I think, around the world is we license our inventions. In other words, we rent them. We don't assign them or sell them. In the US, the law doesn't let us assign the technology if the research was federally funded. In that Bayh-Dole Act I talked about yesterday, which gave academic institutions the right to own inventions that the government had funded the research for, it says you can only license the technology if you want to assign it, you have to ask our permission. And they just won't give that permission. They've made it very clear. Their attitude is that an exclusive license gives the company all the control over the intellectual property they need to successfully commercialize it. In other words, they say, if Google, which is what, the fourth or fifth biggest company in the world, can get started with just an exclusive license from Stanford, that kind of proves our point that an exclusive license gives you all the control over the IP that you need. And I've been talking about living in your parents' basements. About 50% of academic patent applications live in the university's basement. We just can't license them. So I said we decide to patent about half of our inventions, and then of the half we decide to patent, about half we can't license. So in the US, we license about a quarter of the invention disclosures that we receive. As I said, Lisa Nelson said, a hot academic technology is one that two companies are interested in. So why should you license and not assign? Funnily enough, it's about failure, not success. If the licensee finally fails to successfully develop our technology into a product, you want to get that technology back so you can find somebody else to complete the development. It is much easier to get the technology back if you still own that technology. You give the licensee notice of termination of the license. They may object and file a lawsuit or an arbitration, but you get it back. If you assign it, they have to agree to assign it back to you, and that may take some challenge. Now, licensing is a much more precise and flexible process than assigning. You can license exclusively or non-exclusively. You can license, in other words, to one company if you're doing an exclusive license, or to many companies if you're doing it non-exclusively. You can just license part of the rights. You can license different parts to different companies. You can only assign the rights to one company. Licensing, I think, is like a scalpel, very precise. Assigning, I think, is much more like a chainsaw. You just pick one company and that's it. And I want to talk about another way of transferring a technology, which is an option agreement. What is an option? An option locks up a technology temporarily. It allows a potentially interested party to invest in evaluating the technology, and they'll know that if they make that investment and they decide they do want to acquire the rights to it, then those rights will be available to them. If you grant an option, they've got to pay something for that option. You're giving up the rights to license it while the option is in place. You may incur additional costs, perhaps additional patent costs during the option period. And the optionee can walk away at the end of the option period. Often an option is you negotiate a term sheet as part of it, so the company knows that if they make the investment, decide they want it, they know what the costs are going to be. So why do people license technology? Well, because they can't or they don't want to develop the technology. If it's a university, as I said earlier, it's not part of the mission. If they're a small company, perhaps they don't have the resources to take the technology to market. And so they find a bigger company to take over and complete the commercialization process. Perhaps the invention isn't sufficient to market a product. Perhaps it's a platform technology which needs additional inventions to turn it into an actual product. So what you do is you do a deal whereby someone else bears the majority of the financial risk going forward and receives the majority of the reward. Now, the inventor, the licensor, certainly receives part of the reward. So in other words, the inventor of the technology accepts that 5% or 10% or 25%, whatever you have negotiated, is worth more than 100% of nothing, or even 5% or 10% or 25% of a big pie is worth more than 100% of a small pie. So let's talk about types of licenses. You can in-license something. That's when you license something into your organization, when you acquire the right to develop and sell a product. Now, it might be an enabling license. It might include patents and know-how, or it may just give you freedom to operate. Somebody else has got patents that can block you from the marketplace, and so they allow you to pass through those gates in return for a payment. Out-licensing is the opposite of this, granting the rights to intellectual property to others. An enabling license, maybe you're giving up a product to someone with more resources, or it's freedom to operate. You're extracting value from a platform technology that you developed that this other company needs to be part of its product development activity. And then there is cross-licensing. That's when you trade IP rights. You have something they want, they have something you want. So you mutually eliminate roadblocks. And it might be competitive or it might be non-competitive products. You very often find that companies in the same industry get patents on different parts of technologies and need to grant cross licenses to each other. Another way to look at it is an enabling license, which we call like a carrot. It includes know-how, and often the license, the relationship is a collaboration, particularly in the early days. The company that's acquiring the rights to the technology needs to get access to the know-how and expertise of the company that originally developed the technology. It's done, enabling licenses is done at an early stage. The patents are probably still pending. And then you have freedom to operate, which is the stick or an assertion. These are generally naked. They include know-how, just the rights to the patent. They're done close to product launch, and the patents have generally been issued. And then cross-licensing is, I said, two parties grant each other licenses to their patents. You know, they're perhaps agreeing that neither of us control this space. We each have rights that the other needs, and so we will agree that it's a draw, and we'll both share in this market. And it strengthens both of them versus third-party competition. Cross licenses can be royalty bearing or royalty free. I would say they are generally royalty bearing. But obviously the payments from one to the other, they offset. And one of my observations has been that if you are cross licensing, you generally give the other company more advantageous rates than you would to third parties, because you're getting some value from them. Here's a very famous cross license. You can see from December 2004, two big electronic companies, Sony in Japan and Samsung in Korea, are going to share their patents. Sony has 13,000 patents, Samsung has 11,000, and they're going to do a cross license, and they both participate in those various electronics markets. Now, newer companies, they frequently acquire patent portfolios for defensive purposes. For instance, Facebook. Facebook was not the first social network site. It came late to the party. MySpace and Friendster were there well before Facebook. Friendster's first patent was filed in 2003, 4 years before Facebook's first patent. And what Facebook did was it acquired about 1,500 patents from others. And these are some of the details. They got an awful lot from IBM, 750 from IBM, 650 from Microsoft. And it got 16 patents from Friendster, but look at the price it paid for them, over $2 million per patent. The analysis I've done of a lot of patent purchases is the patents generally sell for about $200,000. So these core patents on social networking sites from Friendster were worth 10 times that. And Facebook got sued by Yahoo over 10 patents that Yahoo had. But because it had this portfolio of patents it had bought, it was able to settle the lawsuit, and there was a cross license and a strategic partnership between Facebook and Yahoo. So this shows you the value of patents and the ability to buy and sell them. So let's look at what a license agreement looks like. When you license something to somebody, you're creating a relationship which, if the technology is successful, is going to last 20 years if it's a patent, or maybe even longer if you're licensing something like a trademark or a copyright or some biological materials which don't have the relatively short expiration lifetime of a patent. And the relationships are unequal. The licensor has made their investment in developing the technology. They've said, we don't want to invest in this anymore, but we want to get a return on the investment that we have made. The licensee is now going to take on the risk of completing the development of that technology, and they're going to take on substantial financial risk, and there's an opportunity cost to them. You know, there's a limit to the number of technologies that a company can develop. So by committing to your technology, that means they're going to have to perhaps not develop some of their own ideas. So this is what a license agreement looks like. These are the broad headings you'll find in a license agreement. So the recital is the whereas clauses that you find at the beginning of the license. The license starts out, here's the parties, whereas, and it lists these whereas clauses, and then it says, therefore. So these establish the background to the current agreement. They establish the purpose and the objectives of the parties. And if the technology has been previously licensed and perhaps the license got terminated, it'll include a history of the technology, of those earlier relationships. The whereas clauses are actually non-binding. If there is a conflict between something in the whereas and something in the body of the license, then the words in the body of the license will predominate. Now, a critical part of a license is the definitions. And you need to show in the agreements when you're using defined terms, because they're either capitalized, initial capitalized, or in all capital letters. Stylistically, I don't use like using all caps because I find it breaks up your reading of the agreement by these words or pairs of words suddenly being all caps and standing out from the text around them. So I like to use the initial capitalization. And you will have a section of definitions. Generally, it's Article 1 of the agreement, or it might be in an appendix. So here's an example of defining something in a section of definitions. Licensed patents, and you can see we have a capital L and a capital P, shall mean, and on it goes. Some terms are defined in the text, and they are put in parentheses and quotation marks. So here's an agreement. This license agreement, dated as of June the 20th, 2012, defined to be the effective date. You can see we have quotation marks, and they are initial capitalizations. By and between the trustees of Boston University, which is now defined to be the university. We'll just use the word university throughout the agreement, and we will know that that always means the trustees of Boston University, because the trustees of the university own all its property, and including its intellectual property. Complex agreements between companies can have 200 defined terms and run to 120 pages. I think that's about the longest I've come across in license agreements between companies, life sciences license agreements. University licenses are generally simpler. They tend to have 20 to 30 defined terms and maybe run to 20 or 30 pages. Different degrees of rights can be granted, and this is done in the license grant clause. So look at the degree of transfer of rights. As I said, you can assign the technology, in which case you are completely transferring the rights to the counterparty. Or you can license the technology, in which you give a limited transfer of rights. Or you can grant no rights, but you just promise that you won't sue the company for using the technology. So there's no transfer, just immunity. So you can see that we go from no immunity, from immunity with no transfer of rights, through the limited transfer of rights through a license, to the complete transfer of the rights through an assignment. And then we can, when we license, we can have different degrees of exclusivity. We might grant a non-exclusive license in which we say we're going to grant rights to this technology to anybody who wants to come and get them for us and pay the fees. We might chop the license up. We may give an exclusive license by a particular field of use. Perhaps, in a clean tech world, let's think of, maybe there may be applications of the technology in individual homes, and we'll grant rights to a company that does that. Or maybe it has application in large power plants, and we'll grant a different company rights that. Or we might do exclusive by territory, in which we grant rights to one company in, let's say, India, and rights to a different company that is much stronger in, say, the United States than the Indian company would be. So we give exclusivity by territory. Or we might license the technology exclusively, in which we give all the rights to this one licensee we've picked. So you can see increasing degrees of exclusivity. This is why I said licensing is like a scalpel. You can divide the technology up very precisely and grant the rights to different companies who have the best possibility of developing the technology successfully. So here might be a grant clause. University, defined term, hereby grants an exclusive license, so we've defined that, to make, have made, use, have used, sell, have sold, and import licensed products, again a defined term, under the patent rights, a defined term, within the license field. An exclusive license usually includes the right to grant sublicenses and don't require your licensee to get approval of a sublicense. That used to be a practice when I got into the business. It makes no sense. If you trust this company with your technology and they decide that the best way forward for the technology is to sublicense it to somebody else, then don't second guess them on that. We don't give exclusivity for know-how, often called technology. In fact, some universities don't even license know-how. They say that the know-how is in the professors and the graduate students' heads. So if you want to get access to the know-how, then sign a consulting agreement with them, or even frequently happens, hire the graduate student who did the work, and you get access to it and we don't give exclusivity. Even if we are going to license know-how, we don't give exclusivity, because each time the professor gives a talk or publishes a paper, then they're giving out the know-how. So you just give a non-exclusive license to know-how. And very rarely do universities license trade secrets. Everything that we do should be publishable, and the stuff is kept a trade secret really until it gets to the point where we're ready to publish and we're ready to file patent applications on it. And one of the issues that comes up with early stage technology coming out from an academic institution, where after the license is granted, the professor is going to go on working in the field, is the company is going to say, well, I want rights to the new inventions you make in this space. And I found this can become a contentious area of negotiation when you're licensing something. And I think the consensus is you should grant rights to improvements for no more than 2 to 3 years. And you may find yourself at odds with the professor who thinks this new startup company, particularly if he has an ownership interest in it, should get all the rights for all time going forward. And I've had instances where I had a fight with my professor, and we limited the rights to improvements. And 2 or 3 years later, they said to me, we're so glad you insisted on that, because we've gone in a completely different direction. This company couldn't use those new rights, and we want to start a new company. So that's an important area to focus on. Licensed patents, what the rights are being granted to. You identify them by the number and the title. As I said, often they're going to be at the application stage. And because the portfolio will change as you go through prosecution, you have continuations in part, foreign counterparts. You have to have a mechanism to capture these in the license. The license field, the field of use, this is the subset of all the possible uses of the technology that the licensee is getting rights to. You want to state what is affirmatively included and state what is affirmatively excluded if you're granting licenses to other fields of use. So any planned or previously granted other fields of use you're going to grant licenses to. And you should reproduce the exact wording of the other affirmative grants. So license field shall include all products intended for human therapeutic and prophylactic use, excluding any products in which a DNA construct is introduced into a human patient using a viral vector or by direct injection of a DNA construct. That's what we call gene therapy. So for this, we've given a license for gene therapy. And furthermore, shall exclude all products intended for non-human animal therapeutic and prophylactic use, veterinary uses. So now we've defined another field of use, veterinary uses. And if you look at the veterinary marketplace these days, pharmaceutical companies have by and large spun off their veterinary products. And so different companies can exploit things for treating animals than for treating people. And so you want to put it in a separate field of use. Territory, don't include more than your licensee can reasonably sell in. The major territories you tend to think about are the US, Europe, Japan, China, India. And you need to think about your technology. Is this a manufacturing technology? In which case you're going to need licensees, protection in China or India, low-cost manufacturing countries, or is it a patent that protects a product, in which case you're going to want to protect it in the major markets like the US, Europe, and Japan. Fees, royalties, and payments. This is the fun bit, how we get the value out, and we'll talk about this later. Licensed products. You either identify these by name, and this is obviously if you're licensing at a late stage when the products are known. If you're licensing at an earlier stage, you say a licensed product is something covered by a valid claim, a defined term, of a licensed patent, a defined term. Or another way that's often put is any product which would, but for the license granted hereunder, infringe a valid claim of a licensed patent. And these are legally defined terms under the Universal Commercial Code in the US. You'll need to agree in the license who's going to manage the patents, who's going to manage infringement. Best practice, I think, is for the university to control the prosecution. The licensee certainly gets the right to input, but it's your technology, you should control prosecution. The licensee, we generally want them to reimburse our patent expenses, both those that were incurred before the license and the ongoing costs of prosecution. These can get very expensive, particularly as you start to move into foreign filings in foreign countries. So you get the law firm to bill the university, and the university then bills the licensee. This way, the law firm knows that it's the university is the client, it's the university's technology, not the licensee. When we get on to infringement, exclusive licensees will want the first right to sue for infringement. And generally speaking, the university has to join the lawsuit because we keep enough rights that exclusive licensees don't have standing to sue on their own right. This makes some universities uncomfortable, but it has to be the case that the patent owner has to be involved in the lawsuit. The infringement costs generally get paid by the company, and then if there is a recovery, if you win damages, then the university typically gets 10 to 25% of the money, and the company gets to, first of all, recover its costs and then keep the balance of the damages. The university will generally have the second right to sue, though I think it will probably be a fairly brave university that would choose to sue if its licensee didn't want to sue. But if they do, then you keep all the proceeds. Non-exclusive licensees have no right to sue. And the agreement should probably provide that the university can sue if it chooses, infringes, but isn't obligated to. Then the obligations of the parties. So reports. You will want the licensee to report to you on how the product development is coming along, because you've probably had due diligence obligations in the license. They agree to spend so much on present prosecution. They agree to spend so much on developing the product. They agree to get to a certain stage by a certain date. After the product enters the market, then they'll be sending you reports on the sales of products and the royalty payments that are due. They need to keep their records for you to audit, and you have to have the right to audit generally once a year and for up to 3 years in advance, in arrears. And as I said, the diligence, if you license exclusively, the licensee is your only hope for revenues. And you want them to agree to exert best efforts to develop and commercialize the licensed products. Now, best efforts is a legally defined term, and I would say generally people will only agree to use reasonable efforts or commercially reasonable efforts. There might be specific milestone events. They agreed they'll build a pilot plant by a certain stage, and you'll need to make sure they do. And they may need to make payments when they get to that stage. In the US, we have a particular requirement that if we have exclusively licensed the product, then sales in the US must be manufactured substantially in the US. This is a provision of the law that gave us the right to own government-funded inventions. And you need to have provisions in there that the company will include patent or copyright or trademark notices on the product or the packaging of the product. Representations and warranties, these are the guarantees that we give on the technology. Universities only represent that they have title to the patent rights, and we don't even warrant that we have complete title, because there may be additional inventors that we don't know about. You give no other representations by the university, including that you won't infringe any third-party patents. We won't promise that the technology will even work. You're getting it as is, and it may not work. And these disclaimers of liability have to be in all capital letters and no smaller than 12-point font to be valid in the US. That is a requirement of the Universal Commercial Code. Indemnification insurance. This is what happens if things go wrong. The licensee accepts all liability for their use and any sub-licensee's use of licensed products. The licensee must indemnify the university. Product and other liability insurance is usually required. We generally allow large companies to self-insure, but small companies need to take out insurance policy. So here's a very famous case. Memorial Sloan Kettering University developed a treatment called fyaluridine for hepatitis B. They licensed it to a company called Oclassen, small company, which did a phase 1 trial. And based on the results of that phase 1 trial, sub-licensed it to Eli Lilly, who did a phase 2 trial. And in this phase 2 trial of about 15 people, as I recall, 7 died and 8 needed liver transplants. Just a horrendous issue. Memorial Sloan Kettering and Oclassen suffered no financial loss. Eli Lilly bore all the loss, and Oclassen went on and was successful with a different technology and got sold. This just shows you the importance of this indemnification and insurance. There'll be confidentiality and publication rights. Reports, patent prosecution, other information exchange will be treated as confidential. The university must retain the right to publish its research related to the patent rights. Term and termination. The term of the license is generally the longer of the life of the last to expire patent included within patent rights, or the expiration of any regulatory exclusivity. That's if you're in a healthcare technology, or typically 10 years from first commercial sale, or you might agree some other number on a country-by-country basis. The licensee is free to terminate the license at their option. You can't force them to continue to invest if they don't want to, if their priorities have changed, they've determined the technology doesn't work. You might require them to pay a termination fee, but you also want to return the product, including all the know-how that they've created. They may object, saying we spent a lot of money on that, and the argument is it is your compensation for the fact that they have taken up part of your limited patent life, and you can't get that patent term back. The university can only terminate the license for material breach of the terms and bankruptcy. And if they do terminate the licensee, any sub-licensees in good standing will continue, with the licensor replacing the licensee. And you get a fully paid up perpetual license after expiration of the royalty term. How do we resolve disputes? Well, first of all, there'll be a summit meeting between the presidents or something like that. There might be mediation, there might be arbitration, or there may be no alternative dispute resolution, and you just go straight to court. International agreements usually specify arbitration either by the International Commercial Code or WIPO as a set of rules that can be used. And then there'll be miscellaneous provisions, who gives notice that you can't use the university's name, what law it's going to be interpreted under. New York State is a very popular choice for international agreements. What can happen with assigning the technology? Do you need permission to assign the license to somebody else? Can it be automatically assigned to somebody who's acquiring the entire company or the entire business line that the license relates to? Here's a picture of what we've happened in the US. You can see this goes back to 1996, and you can see that the number of exclusive licenses has gone up slightly over this 30-year period. The number of non-exclusive licenses has gone up substantially, and as a result, the percent of non-exclusive licenses has gone up substantially. And you can see that the number of licenses to startups has gone up substantially over this period. And this shows our licensing mix. In the US, we define a large company as being a company with 500 employees or more. This is because there are various government support mechanisms to support large companies, small companies, and the cutoff is 500. Now, in most countries, 500 would be called medium, so we have SMEs. In the US, we don't, we just have small and large. And you can see the number of licenses to large companies has trended down. The number of licenses to startup companies has gone up from about 10% to close to 20%. And the number to existing small companies has kind of held reasonably constant in the 50 to 60% range. So how do you get value through a license? How do you divide up the value of the technology between the licensor and the licensee? So valuation in licensing is a whole separate topic that I think we will be covering in the 5-day course in June. As a general proposition, when you transfer a technology, the developer of the technology, the licensor, stops investing in it, and they want to get a return on the investment they've already made. The licensee starts investing and takes on the investment risk going forward. They get the bulk of the return. There is a rule called the Goldscheider principle, or the 25% rule, one of those business rules that works in practice. It says the licensor should receive 25% and the licensee should receive 75% of the pre-tax profits from a licensed product. This 25% rule was based on empirical observations in the 1950s and 60s. Robert Goldscheider was licensing US television company technologies for international use. And he had a complete IP portfolio, patents, ongoing development of new know-how, trademarks, copyrighted product materials. And he found that the licensees were making about a 20% pre-tax profit and paying a 5% royalty. They were either number one or number two in their market, despite competition. And the licenses only had a 3-year term. So they could readily renegotiate if the terms were burdensome, inappropriate. But he found they happily renewed the licenses, and he concluded that this relationship, a 5% royalty and a 20% pre-tax profit, resulted in successful long-term win-win relationships. Now you apply it to a fully enabling technology, and you need to prorate if other IP is also needed. And it's also applied to the fully loaded pre-tax profits, not the gross margin on making the product. So you express it as a percent of net sales in the license. The royalty rate is 25% times the expected pre-tax profit margin. So let's look at an example for a patent that fully enables the product. $200 selling price, $100 to manufacture it, cost of goods sold, $50 sales, research, and administration costs. So there is a $50 pre-tax profit. Then the patent owner's share should be a quarter of that, or 12.5%. And so the royalty rate would be 12.5 divided by the $200 sales price. So that would be a 6.25% running royalty rate. If the patent 75% enables the product, then 4.69, 50%, 3.13, 10%, 0.63. You want to express it as a percent of net sales, but it's almost never the final rate agreed to. As I say, you adjust it according to the enabling value after you've analyzed manufacturing costs, market dynamics, value add by the licensee, etc., and adjust it according to the enabling value. And you round things off, 4.5, not 4.69, 3, not 3.13, and so on. I founded the 25% rule of limited value in academic license and negotiations because the technology is such an early stage, but there's incomplete cost data available at that point. I found it very helpful when you're licensing to a new industry and you go in and look at what the profit levels are in that industry. I want to talk about value and risk. There's a very fundamental relationship. As risk goes down, value goes up. And this is of great importance in licensing, because when we license a technology at the beginning of its lifetime, we're over here. The risk is highest, and so the value is lowest. And as the licensee develops that technology and reduces the risk and finally gets it into the marketplace, the value of the technology goes up. And a fundamental principle of license valuation is that you probably shouldn't even try to get paid upfront in full. Our job is to extract the value over time so that we share in the growth in value. So I don't know whether you have this sports drink in America, in India, called Gatorade, but it was invented by a professor at the University of Florida, and he offered his licensee, a company called Stokely Van Camp, the rights for $1 million, and that was patent applications, a trade secret formula, data, and a trademark. They declined. They said the test market would cost $1 million, so if they paid him $1 million, it would double their financial risk. But they offered to pay royalties. Oops, sorry, something got wrong there. Sorry, this got altered in translation. Over the 60 years since that deal was done, Stokely Van Camp and the companies that have bought it have paid the University of Florida, or Robert Cade, close to $2 billion. So instead of paying $1 million up front, they've paid $2 billion over time. And in fact, there was a dispute between the University of Florida and Cade, and Cade's trust got the bulk of the money, and the University of Florida got 20%. But you can see, it was a good business decision at the time that would double our risk if we paid you up front, but we'll share the risk and pay you out over time.
Dr. Stevens?
Yes.
Before you go on to value extracted in a license, we are good to stop if you are ready.
Yep. I was just
Okay.
going to suggest this would
Yeah.
be a good time to stop.
Yeah, I thought so. Thank you so much. We'll break for the quiz. If you could stop your sharing, my colleagues would share their screen to show the QR code for the quiz. I would also request the participants to kindly switch on their cameras once they attempt the quiz. We want to take one quick photograph, and we would also take a few questions which we have received on the chat box before we move on to the next 55 minutes of your lecture.
Let's focus on the questions first. Yeah, please
Yeah.
send the link on the chat box as well.
Yeah, it's on the chat box as well as on the screen. Request all the participants to kindly attempt the quiz. This would also mark as your attendance for the day.
This will be also a good time for people to take a quick bio break, right? They want to. But be back soon, please.
I would request my colleague Mugdha to alert us when 5 minutes are over for the quiz. Maybe we can stop the screen sharing now so that we can see people on the screen for a quick video once they are done with the quiz. You can see the chat box, Mr. Kiran. Chat box has the link to the quiz. Can you access it, please?
Let's see, Ashley.
I have posted once again the link. Those who have not yet completed the quiz, I have received many responses at the back end. Thanks all for attempting the quiz.
I think some people are not yet online, right? Video.
Yeah.
Some people have not yet joined.
They might be completing the quiz.
Yeah, there. I have a third screen.
Yeah, it has just come.
Thank you. Good. I think.
Yeah.
We should have covered most of the people, isn't it? Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody,
Yeah.
for
Thank you so
filling in
much.
the poll. There'll be one at the end today. Remember
Yeah.
to do that as well. Those will have more trickier questions for you.
Thank you so much. I think we can proceed with the questions now, sir.
Okay. Let's go. Is Ashley back? Yeah. Request everybody else to kindly switch off their videos now. Yeah. Ashley, can you take some questions now, please? We'll give a couple of minutes, please. There are quite a few questions which have come up. I'll take some of these with Ashley as soon as he is back. Hello, Ashley. Can we take these questions?
Okay.
Okay, good. Let me just quickly run through a few of them. There are some questions which I'll just take it in the sequence in which they came without trying to rearrange them. But the models which you have described today, are these applicable to startups also who might be planning to license their technologies out?
Yes. Startups are a very special case. They don't have much money, so the university shouldn't be looking to get much cash up front. You get compensated by shares in the startup company. But as the technology moves forward, you'll expect the startup to pay normal financial terms. As I'll talk in a moment, sub-licensing is a very important part of startup licenses, because very frequently a startup company will do the initial development of a technology, but then they will do a deal with a bigger company with manufacturing and selling capacity to take the technology to market. And so what they get from their partner gets shared with the university is a very important topic, and perhaps the most important topic in that license agreement.
I think Ashley, this question was from Dr. Vanita Prasad. I think she also wants to know if the technology is developed by a startup and they are licensing it out, do the same principles apply?
Yes, generally so, but accepting the technology is at a farther advanced stage and its risk has been reduced.
Yes, and one other thing that often comes up when private entities are licensing is that the licensee may seek certain assurances and guarantees which probably they will not seek from university environment. Am I right?
Yeah, as I said, universities will give no promises. In the US, many universities have big endowments, and they're an attractive target for lawsuits. So you make absolutely no commitments. You say, look, these are the patents. Here's what we know about them. You take it as is. We make no promises that you can practice this without infringing other patents. And we make no representation that the technology will work. As when the licensee is starting to talk to its partner, now they will have to make some commitments.
Yep, and that's quite a big difference, which often comes up. There's a question from Dr. Indrani Ghosh. It says, if the product development fails and the deal is cancelled, is there a possibility of misuse by licensee because now they have access to the complete disclosure? What precautions should be taken before the deal? Just a little bit of context. Please remember that sometimes some of these organizations would also be doing know-how licenses where it's not just only protected by a patent. So keep that in mind as well for this question, please.
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I thought the premise
I think
was that if the technology has failed, then to a certain extent.
No, I think no, but what's happened is that they have actually licensed some know-how, and there is some background, SOPs and so on and so forth that's now part with the company. They don't want to pursue it further. The deal is closed. How do we prevent misuse of that transferred know-how or the disclosure?
That's difficult. This is where patents come in. If you own a patent and the license is terminated, you've got the patent back. If the company goes ahead and still uses the technology that's the subject of the patent, you can sue them, or a subsequent licensee can sue them. It is hard with know-how. And you certainly, you've seen Apple has been going through a massive lawsuit over some sensor technology that it put in the Apple Watch. And this company asserts they wanted to license it from us. We taught them all about it. And then they terminated the license. And oh, look, they've done it themselves. And they say they managed to do that without any use of our technology. And that's been the subject of a big lawsuit. Yep.
In fact, it's for including things like pulse oximetry and so on and so forth. You're right. Right. Okay, let me just quickly go to a couple of other quick questions. Archana Joshi has a question. Rights granted to licensee under license agreements are the same for a startup company and MNC as licensee. Are they same? If no, what will be the difference that the licensor needs to consider while drafting the license agreement?
No, I think the principles are the same.
Do you tilt the upfront and royalties differently? Would you consider, I think you're not considering spin-outs and equity arrangements here, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, there is a very, very fundamental difference between American licensing practice to startups and British and I think Australian. In Britain and I think Australia, they tend to license fully paid up for a large equity stake. In the US, we take a small equity stake and we get normal running royalty provisions. And I think this is a very superior way to do it. Equity can be diluted. Royalties aren't diluted. I came across a case of the University College London spin-out. It was acquired by Amgen, and the product is in the marketplace. It was acquired by Amgen for $1 billion. And because the company had gone through 6 rounds of financing, one of which was highly dilutive because they got into trouble, University College London and the inventor, who they had each got 25% of the initial equity, and then the seed investors got the other half. So the company sold for $1 billion. University College London and the inventor had 25% each of the seed round. They got £500 each because there had been such dilution of the equity. The graduate student who joined the company as the chief scientific officer, and the company gave him stock options in each round of financing, he made many millions of dollars. Had the university got royalties, the product was successful, they would have made millions and millions of dollars. So that's an example of an all equity bet going wrong. In the US, we don't do that. We take a small equity stake and we get normal royalty provisions.
There's a question from Vikas Dhar. You license a technology in the form of a patent application, and the prosecution waters down the invention substantially, but the licensee has to pay for all the costs. Is that fair? Although it should be done, it should have done a good due diligence.
Sorry, what was the last one?
I think he's saying that perhaps the licensee should have done better due diligence, but what happens is you license a technology as a licensee from a licensor, and during prosecution, the patents get diluted or watered down substantially. How is that dealt with?
You have to do the due diligence up front. You know, you look at the prior art report that the law firm obtained. Do your own prior art search, your own evaluation. Look at the prosecution history. Prosecution history is a public document. You can see every deliberation that the patent examiner went through. So you have to do your due diligence, and if you were wrong, you were wrong.
Pragya, please alert me when I'm out of time, but I'll continue with my questions till then. Okay,
Yeah.
Kulbir Lamba.
1.5 minute more.
Sure. Kulbir Lamba has a question. Do we quantify first commercial sale, or how? Example, number of units sold or the proceeds from the sale, etc. So for example, if you put a benchmark for first commercial sale, how do we typically do it? For a milestone payment, I suppose.
Well, when they sell it. Now there might be introductory pricing, but when it's a commercial sale, rather than a beta placement, when we say, look, we'll give you this to play with, and please tell us what you find, the problems, the issues. I mean, I think first commercial sale is normally fairly clearly defined.
Should that be a milestone at all, first commercial sale, or should it be based on volumes and value?
Well, there'll be a definition of what you mean by first commercial sale.
Yeah.
And generally, it's, you know, when you start selling commercially.
There's a question from Kishore Shengve, which says, before licensing the IP, it's important that the valuation of the IP should be valued properly. So my question is there a specific IP valuation process? Is there a need for an authorized IP valuator? Does it form part of the activities of the TTO? You did mention that we'll discuss more later, but maybe briefly you can address it.
I think generally these are not, IP is not valued independently. The university comes up with its value that it seeks, and it will have the evidence to support that. The licensee company will then need to decide what it puts it on the books at. And generally, I think they tend to get written down to zero because of the risk of development at this stage.
We'll also be discussing more about licensing later in the June program, I mean the valuations. So we'll reserve some of that for later as well. I think we have run out of time, but one last question I'll take up for people is, does the US university system use TRLs as an indicator, technology readiness level as an indicator for any decisions at all relating to licensing?
That's a good question. I mean, the TRL was invented in the US by NASA. I have to say that you come across it referred to, I think, more internationally than I do in the US. But yes, we are aware of it. You know, we are aware of the 9 scales, and we're painfully aware of how low university inventions are when they emerge from the lab. And that issue of how do you raise the TRL through proof of concept funding is a major issue for US universities. It is for universities around the world.
But does it influence your licensing decisions in any way?
No, I mean, you have to get the deal done.
Yeah.
You know, it is what it is. If it's a TRL 2 or 3, then you're going to have probably trouble finding a licensee. And you know, if you can find a small amount of money that, I mean, one of the interesting observations is that you can get quite an increase in TRL for a relatively modest amount of money. And that is, you know, where translational research programs come in.
Okay, I think I'll stop with that and I'll let you continue, Ashley, and I'll come back later with some more questions after you're done. Right. In the meantime, please feel free. Everybody can type it in the chat box. I will take up some of these to the extent that time permits towards the end as well. I've noted down those. I've not missed the others. So I'll come back to those as well. Okay. Please, Ashley, you can continue. Thank you.
Okay. Whoops. Where are we? Okay. Where is value extracted in a license? So you have an upfront fee. You have ongoing pre-commercial payments. You have patent costs. You have milestone payments. You have annual minimum royalties. There might be some research collaboration and support for that research. There'll be sub-license income sharing. And then there'll be earned royalties on product sales. So there are 3 basic types of payment: fixed lump sum payments, single payments you get as long as the license is in effect. So the upfront fee, the annual maintenance fee, annual minimum royalties, you'll get those as long as the license is in effect. And then there'll be contingent lump sum payments, single payments you get if certain things happen. So you might get a milestone payment when a patent issues. You may get milestone payments when the technology reaches a certain stage of development. You might get a milestone payment when sales hit certain levels. If the company goes public or gets acquired, then you'll get some money from the shares that you took as part of it. And then if there's a sub-license, then there may be sub-license payments. And these share the increase in value of the technology as it's developed. And then there are running royalties, payments that depend on the extent of the licensee's use of the licensed technology. And you'll see some of these payments are made pre-commercialization. You know, the development milestones, the patent milestones, the upfront fee, the annual maintenance fee, annual minimum royalties. And some of them are made after the technology reaches commercialization. So the sales milestones are perhaps the sub-license payments and the running royalties. The upfront payment is generally a cash fee. From the licensee's point of view, it includes the sunk patent costs, and it reflects the initial value of the technology being transferred. And as I say, that is typically relatively low for academic technologies. And a newco, startup company, may only be able to pay in stock. They don't have a lot of cash. You want that cash to go into developing the technology. They have a lot of stock. Take the stock. The ongoing pre-commercial payments, say the patent costs, milestone payments, these reflect the increase in the value of the technology to the licensee as they make progress. These are particularly common with life science inventions because everybody knows what a phase 1 trial is, a phase 2 trial, a phase 3 trial, product approval, patent milestones, sales milestones. And then annual minimum royalties, these can be a due diligence mechanism. You know, if the company is not developing the technology, they won't want to make annual payments. And these typically escalate substantially after 3 or so years. The assumption being that if the company is still paying them, then the technology must be working, and so it is increasing in value. And these tend to be a more common mechanism with physical sciences inventions rather than life sciences. And that's because, as I said, in life sciences, everybody knows what a phase 1 trial is. But if you're developing a new process and you say, well, you've got to build a pilot plant, and that'll be a milestone. Well, is a pilot plant something that makes, 1 kilogram a batch, or is it something that makes, 50 kilograms or 5% of commercial scale or whatever? You would argue over it, and so you don't want to have arguments. So having this mechanism where the annual minimum royalties increase substantially is often a good resolution for physical sciences inventions. Sub-license income sharing is really important. With a startup, this may be where the real value is created. The challenge is that you're going to negotiate these provisions when you do your initial deal, years before the sub-license happens. And the parties don't know how that sub-license is going to be structured. And you want to make sure that the licensee can't game the system by structuring the sub-license to minimize what it pays the university. The way we do that is the university gets a piece of every payment that the licensee gets from the sub-licensee. You will pay me every which way there is, a guy called Lou Burnham once famously said. And you have an exclusion for items for which there's a deliverable and are documented. So if the licensee is going to get research support payments from the sub-licensee, you don't get a part of that. If the sub-licensee buys shares in the licensee, you don't get a part of that. There have been 3 models that have been developed, what I call the pass-through. This is when the university gets the same running royalty on the sub-licensee sales as if the licensee sold the product. So let's say you're going to get 4% of sales, and it doesn't matter whether the licensee makes those sales or the sub-licensee makes those sales. And then you get a set percentage of every payment that the licensee gets other than running royalties, sometimes termed non-royalty income. Then there's an allocation. The university gets a set percentage of every payment the licensee gets from the sub-licensee, including running royalties. And one of the reasons a licensee may argue for this is, look, they say, what if I have to give you a 6% royalty and I can only get a 10% royalty from the sub-licensee? You're going to get 6%. I'm only going to keep 4% for all the work I've done. So instead, let's agree you'll get a percentage of what I get. And then there's a tiered allocation when the university gets a lower percent of payments received from the sub-licensee before commercialization and a higher percentage of the running royalties after commercialization. And the argument to do it this way would be it allows the licensee to use those payments from the sub-licensee to develop the technology and to avoid raising capital and diluting the university's ownership stake. And the percentages in this latter case may be based on the timing of the sub-licensee after the license execution. No, let's say 25% in year 1, 20% in year 2, 15% in year 3 and afterwards, something like that. Or the stage of clinical development. So you get 25% if you do the license, sub-license up to phase 1, 20% up to phase 2, and 15% up to phase 3, because again, the sub-licensee has been making, the licensee has been making much more investment in the technology to get it to this later stage. So less of the value that's being transferred came from you and more that came from them. Here's an example, the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccines. Key enabling technology is the 2005 Weissman-Carico substitution technology, uridine for pseudouridine and cytidine for 5-methylcytidine-O. Penn filed patents on this in 2006, and Weissman and Carico founded a company in 2007. They only got SBIR grants, ceased operations in 2013, didn't license the Penn patents. And Penn licensed a company in Wisconsin called CellScript, which spun out a subsidiary called mRNA Ribotherapeutics. They got $300,000 up front, and they sub-licensed the rights to Moderna and BioNTech. Here are the license terms. You can get them by reading Moderna's and BioNTech's annual reports. And Moderna paid $641 million in 2021, and Pfizer's sales were 2 times Moderna's. So the total royalties were about $2 billion. Penn's royalty income in 2020, they made $30 million. 2021, they made $310 million. In 2022, they made $1.3 billion. Pretty damn good, but could it have been $2 billion? Now, Carico and Weissman, they get 30% of the income, plus 12.5% for research. So I think their retirement accounts look pretty good. And of course, they won the 2023 Nobel Prize. Running royalties, also called earned royalties, these are the main post-commercialization economic component of the license. And this is where you're going to have the biggest long-term impact if the product is successful. And it's an equation. The royalty payments are the royalty base multiplied by the royalty rate. And the payments are made for the duration of the royalty term, which we already looked at. So the royalty base is a measure of the extent of the licensee's return from using the technology. It might be the number of units sold. It might be sales. It might be profits. If you're going to use profits, define them very, very carefully. Gross profits or net profits or profits after taxes. By and large, universities shouldn't be basing royalties on profits. Companies, when they're doing big deals at late stages of development, yes, they frequently do profit-sharing deals. But I think it's a risky thing for a university to do. Profit-based licenses are very, very expensive to audit. The most common term is the net sales, which is gross sales, either less standard deductions for things like shipping, insurance, returns, or a standard reduction, typically 2 or 3%. And the royalty rate is how much of the licensee's return from using the technology you get. It can either be flat, in other words, you get the same royalty rate for all sales, or it can be tiered, in which case you get a royalty rate that's different at different levels of sales. And by and large, the royalty rate should go up as the sales of the product go up, because basic marketing theory says that bigger selling products are more profitable because you have a bigger base of sales to spread your fixed costs over. And then that 25% rule we looked at says that the royalty rate should reflect the profitability. So at higher sales levels, the royalty rate should be higher. And then we talk about the royalty term, how long we get paid. Universities usually use the last to expire patent on a country-by-country basis. As I said, companies frequently use the longer of the last to expire patent, expiration of regulatory exclusivity, and 10 years or more from first commercial sale. 12 or 15 on a country-by-country basis. And I really think universities should use this formulation much more often. You do need a royalty step down after patents expire. Supreme Court decisions say that a 50% step down is traditional, though a smaller step down meets that test. I've been working on a lawsuit where the composition of matter patent was filed in the 1970s, and a new use was discovered in the 1990s and received FDA approval in 2019, so 40 odd years after the drug was developed. And the term was poorly worded, and in fact, there was a settlement where the licensor did not get very much from those later sales. You do see corporate licenses with no step down. Obviously, they will be unenforceable in court, and I think companies do them because they know that if they ever contested the royalty rate, no company would have a license to them again. So let's look at an example. And I use a life sciences example. A license issue fee of $50,000, annual minimum royalties of $10,000 a year for the second to the fourth year, $25,000 a year for years 5 to 7, $50,000 a year thereafter. Milestone payments, $50,000 in year 3, $100 in year 4, $250 in year 5, $500 in year 6. A royalty rate of 5%, sunk patent costs of $75,000, and annual patent costs of $10,000 to $25,000 a year. And then let's say these are the sales. Product sales start in year 7, climb, reach a plateau of 25 million in years 13, 14, and 15, and then start to decline. Oh dear, I'm sorry. There was a slide supposed to go in there which showed the flow of money after through that license agreement. And I think it's sufficiently important. I'm going to stop sharing and go and find. I will be back with you. I'm locating that slide I want to show. Okay.
Is it with a team? Shall I request them to pull it out?
Nope, I got it here.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Messed that up. Okay, can you see this now, this chart?
We can.
Good. Okay. So you can see several things on this. You can see that here the blue are the fixed price payments, green is the patent cost reimbursements, and red are the running royalties. So you can see that, as I said, the bulk of the return comes from the running royalty payments. They clearly vastly outweigh all the other payments. Secondly, you can see the payments you get at the beginning are really modest compared with these. And the only substantial lump sum payments are the late stage milestone payments. So the lesson this gives you is that in negotiating your license, you should focus on success, focus on the late stage milestone payments and the running royalties. Don't try and mess things up at the beginning here by trying to negotiate too hard for payments early, because they will cost you, you'll have to give up a lot in terms of payments down the road. So I'm going to stop sharing there and then go back to the So best practices and lessons learned. You need to have a good template agreement. And everything in your template agreement is in there for a reason. I'm going to give you an example at the end. And we, certainly in the US, license agreements have evolved. Academic license agreements have evolved. A lot of them are published. A lot of universities put them on their websites, and we will be very able to supply you with good template agreements to start from. The licensor should do the first draft, starting from the template. The reason is, your template will have everything in you need. And then you can see any changes that the counterparty wants to make to it. If you start from one of their templates, you have to check to make sure that the provisions you need are in there. So it's easier to start from your template. Here's a book that I read 60 years ago that I've never forgotten. It was written by a journalist who, with two other men, tried to fly a helium balloon over the game herds of Africa to observe them without the game herds of Africa being aware that they were being observed. And at one point in the book, he says, the safety rules of ballooning are essentially a recapitulation of the accidents that have happened. And I think the safety rules of licensing are essentially a recapitulation of the accidents that have happened. As there have been important lawsuits or disputes, legal judgments, new laws, people have incorporated the remedy for this in their template agreements. So here's an example, Listerine. I don't know if you have it in India. It's a very famous and popular mouthwash. It's yellow. It has a rather medicinal taste. It was invented in 1881 by John Lawrence in St. Louis, Missouri. And he licensed it to a pharmacist, Jordan Lambert. He had a trade secret formula, and they founded the Lambert Pharmacal Company, and they sold this Listerine product. And here's the entire agreement. No men buy all these presents, etc., that I will pay a monthly sum to the said J.J. Lawrence's heirs, executors, or assigns, the sum of $20 for each and every gross of sold Listerine. So on, 1881. Well, the formula was accidentally published sometime in the 1930s. And in 1955, Lambert merged with Warner to form Warner Lambert, a company that existed till quite recently. And they stopped paying royalties. They said the trade secret they had bought was no longer a trade secret. Well, the heirs to John Lawrence sued, and the judge agreed. He said the agreement says, as long as you sell, you pay. It doesn't say, as long as it's a trade secret, you pay. So that's why our license agreements have grown so much longer, allowing for all these incidents. And Johnson & Johnson, which owns the rights to Listerine now, is still paying royalties to the heirs of John Lawrence. And in fact, you can buy the rights to receive royalties. They got divided up and some got sold a few years ago. So let's talk about licensing versus assigning. As I said, in the US, we don't assign because the Bayh-Dole Act doesn't allow us to assign without permission of the funding agency. And as I said, they won't give it. Other countries don't have this protection, and you can come under pressure to assign. You can write an assignment agreement with the same payment terms as a license. It doesn't have to be fully upfront. I have assigned a technology that wasn't federally funded, so I didn't have to ask permission. So I did an assignment agreement. I have to say, I learned the hard way that licensing is preferable to assigning because those issues of failure did come into play. So you can have upfront and contingent success-based payments. As I said, the difference is in the balance of power if things go wrong. So you may have no choice but to assign. Do you want me to invest in your spin out or don't you? If you're given a choice like that, you're probably going to assign. Then I think you should only assign when commercial success is assured. Initially license, and then agree to assign when, let's say, the company gets acquired by a major company. Define what's a major company. Is it market capitalization? Is it revenues? Maybe you assign when the company completes an initial public offering on a major stock exchange, so you can sell your shares. Or when the company's revenues from the licensed products hit an agreed target, and so you're not going to have any risk of needing to assign the agreement anymore. Maybe you include an assignment fee or an exit fee. So that's what I have done here. I did include some additional slides, Premnath, on looking at the results of technology transfer in the US. We can either take questions or we can go through those slides, your choice.
I think I would suggest that we can talk about that first and then come back to the questions. There are quite a few, but I would like to cover some ground, more ground if possible. Please go ahead.
Okay. So we have this organization in the US called Autumn, formerly the Association of University Technology Managers. I was president, John Fraser was president. And in 1993, we started doing a survey, an annual survey of tech transfer activity in the US. And we've done it every year since. And so we've got, a 30-year history. And this shows the number of invention disclosures we get in the US. That's in red. And in blue and the right-hand scale, I've shown you the amount we spend on research. And that was about $90 billion in 2023. And you can see on the left-hand scale, we're getting about 25,000 invention disclosures a year in the US. And you can see how they've gone up very steadily. This shows our patenting activity. The yellow line shows the percent of inventions that we file on. And you can see that's on the right-hand scale. It's in the 50 to 60% range. You can see in green the number of issued patents we get. In blue, you can see the new patent applications. And you can see we file on about 50% of the invention disclosures we get. And then you often need to file additional patent applications in prosecution. And the red line shows the total number of patent applications that we prosecute each year. This shows the employment of people in tech transfer in the US. It's a pretty small bunch of people. The yellow line is the total employment. The red line is the support staff. And you can see that professional staff has not gone up very much in the last 10 years or so. And I've shown the number of invention disclosures that we've received in green. And you can see that as total FTEs have gone up, so has the number of invention disclosures that we're managing. Obviously, doing a lot of patent applications, legal expenses go up in line with them. And you can see here that the blue line is our total expenditures from the previous chart. And then the red line is how much we get reimbursed by our licensees. And the green line is the net amount we spend. It's about $250 million a year we spend. And you can see on the orange line at the top, we're getting about 50% of our patent expenses reimbursed by our licensees. This is the licensing activity. You can see we're doing about 10,000 licenses a year in the US. You can see we have about 50,000 active licenses. So these are licenses which are still, the product is still being developed or where the product is in the marketplace. And you can see we're getting some sort of revenue on about half of these. And of those, we're getting running royalties from a product in the marketplace on about half of those. So about 10,000 products a year are paying royalties from products in the marketplace. Here is the income we get. It's a little choppy because there have been some big sales of equity. There have been some monetizations of royalties. But you can see we make a lot of money at this these days. It's grown substantially, that blue line, the net income, starting at about $200 million a year in 1991, and we're approaching $4 billion in 2022, which is the last year for which the survey results have been published. This is the number of startups that have been formed. When we started doing this survey in 1993, we said, okay, how many startups have you done since the Bayh-Dole Act until 1992? And that was about 850. And you can see the number of startups has climbed steadily. It even kept climbing here through the great financial crisis. It's flattened out a bit over the last few years. So here's the context.
Sure. Actually, before we go to questions, if you just go back a little to the slide which was talking about the earnings, the one before this, right? This one. Yeah, I think one has to keep this thing in context that this amount is about 2 to 5% of the research expenditure, right? And it is not something which can replace research expenditure. Also, the research expenditure, which because the government puts in quite a lot of money into research, it's able to create IP, which industry cannot create on its own, right? So one of the observations which I wanted to make and which I see in India is that it is important to keep that in context when we are looking at getting revenues from technology licensing, and one has to be a little more realistic in the Indian context. What is your view on that?
Oh, absolutely. The first research I did when I entered the tech transfer profession in 1991, when we really didn't know whether this was a financially sustainable activity, I looked at the history of royalty income, and it had taken 10 years from the passage of Bayh-Dole to get to where income was even at $200 billion. In 1980, I found one study done by the government, I think, that found that royalty income to all universities in 1980 was about $7 billion. So it took 10 years to get to this level, and then you can see it's climbed steadily since. But this is a massive amount of research funding, and we've learned to do an effective job of technology licensing and valuing the technologies over this 40-year period since the passage of Bayh-Dole.
The other thing, which you have mentioned here, the Stanford's sale of stock of Google stock. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Stanford license to Google was very generous. It was. Do you know the terms of the license? And from my understanding, Stanford benefited a lot from just goodwill from the startup as well.
So I know they did get some running royalties. I don't know what they were. They made about $338 million from selling the stock. But then Brin and Page, the two founders, they made $10 billion when Google went public. So, and what really amused me was they were entitled Brin was entitled to an inventor's share, and Stanford gave him the inventor's share of their sales of stock, which I thought was very generous since he made 10 billion in the IPO. But I don't know what the running royalty rates were.
I think and if I'm not mistaken, stock was not part of the deal, right? It was a separate.
Oh no, it was. Absolutely it was.
It was just part of the licensing deal. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me go.
I asked Kathy Koo, I said, when did you report it to Autumn? And she said, well, we never did because we thought it would make us look greedy. So that's why the number was public, and I put it on here to show that we have made some money from sales of stock. But you can see the green line shows that the bulk of the money comes from running royalties. So that's consistent with that chart I showed earlier. And then all others, the milestone payments and things like that, have grown in importance. And equity has increased in levels of income really only since about 2007, 2006.
Yeah, I think I'll before I go to the questions, I'll let Pragnya throw in the next quiz, and then we'll take on a few more questions, please. Can you unshare, please, for a moment, Ashley?
Yeah, requesting my colleagues to kindly share the screen with the QR code for our quiz number 2, as well as the link for the quiz number 2 in the chat box. Okay, it's already here. You have
2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Yeah,
Let's
2-3
try
minutes to attempt it. Yeah.
Will I continue with the questions, Pragnya, in the meantime? You're on mute.
Just allow, I think, 30 seconds more, because just now we have started getting responses. Probably people are attempting those, so they may not pay attention to answers.
Probably required a little more thinking.
Yeah, first two questions, especially.
Okay. Mugdha, maybe you can put in the quiz one as well for people who missed it. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead with the questions, please.
Yeah, now we can. We have reached more than half the mark. Yeah,
Can you close the
QR code. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, actually, we have some more questions here. There's a question from Gaurav Sawant, which asks if there are multiple patents for the same product, then how is value distributed? So, situation where you're licensing, just for a moment, imagine two different set of patents to a given licensee. How do they decide how, who's responsible for what value creation in a license?
That's a great question because it can get quite complex if you have a big portfolio. So first you have to, you have two distribution issues. One is how do you distribute to the inventors of the patent? And I would say best practice here is to divide equally between them. And you can allow them to all sign a piece of paper agreeing to something different, but your starting point should be equality. And you can even allow the inventors to include somebody who isn't an inventor but made a big contribution to get some share of it. Allocating the value between different patent families, that can get quite difficult. I think you have to look at the value that each patent brings to the final product. So I'm going to use a life sciences example because that's what I mainly work in. I know we're doing clean tech here, but if you have a composition of matter patent on a drug, and then you have another patent on a method of use, then by far the bulk of the value would go to the composition of matter because that covers all potential uses for the drug.
And it's a TTO's job to work out those numbers and get agreement of all the patent holders, or is it a part of a policy?
The patent policy will generally only specify how much of the income goes to the inventors, how much goes for research, how much goes to the university, how much goes to the tech transfer office. The allocation between families and between inventors is usually done by the tech transfer office.
There's a question from Mahesh Sitagiri about what are the best practices to ensure field of use restrictions are enforceable across jurisdictions.
Well, as I said, you need a very clear license grant with the same words appearing in what you give to the one company that you explicitly are excluding from the other company.
Yeah. There's a question from Shweta Mishra, which says how to understand the evaluation of products. Certainly, many times we underestimate or overestimate. Probably this has got to do with the valuation as well. In any given discussion, negotiation is all about what the buyer and the seller agrees to. Is there any? There can be guiding principles, but are there any situations where you can have a fair deal where both parties are happy with it?
You certainly want a fair deal. I mean, I always say that, you shouldn't have a smiley face, because if one has a smiley face, the other presumably has a frowny face. You want a horizontal line. Each party has made concessions and they finished up with a deal they can live with.
Yeah.
I think that chart I showed of risk versus value is one of the fundamental principles of technology evaluation. And I think
Yeah.
a second fundamental principle is to have a basis for your valuation. You haven't just plucked a number out of the air, but you've looked at a comparable transaction, or you've attempted to do a analysis of the increase in profitability that your technology will bring to this product. But you've done some calculations, you have some evidence, and then in your negotiation, they will negotiate, you will discuss your bases. It'll be a rational negotiation. It might be a difficult negotiation, but it's rational. If you have no basis for your valuation, then you have an emotional negotiation, and that's a very difficult negotiation.
Anand Pandey has a question: when licensing early stage academic research that requires significant investment to commercialize, how can we fairly value the technology and structure royalties to balance the university's contribution with the licensee's development risks?
So, I think you can look at technologies that get transferred multiple times, from the university to a startup company, from the startup company to a bigger company, to the startup company getting acquired. And you see the value of the technology going up each stage as it gets developed and risk gets reduced. So the example I used, it was a lawsuit, quite a public lawsuit between the University of California, Los Angeles, and a startup company called Medivation over a cancer drug, Xtandi, prostate cancer. And the university licensed it for a 4% running royalty. When Medivation did a deal at the start of phase 3 to a Japanese drug company, Astellas, they got a 50-50 profit split, reflecting the additional work that they had put in to get the drug from the preclinical stage that UCLA had got it to where it was in phase 3 and 2 years away from approval, that when Astellas acquired rights to it. So that shows you how the terms change as the technology gets developed and the risk gets reduced and the value goes up.
Can I take a few more questions if you don't mind?
Please.
Ashley? Yeah.
Yeah.
Tamal Bose has a question. What are the complications when signing international agreements and contracts?
So first of all, international agreements are all done in English. And generally the English version, if there is a dispute between the wording of the contract in other languages and the English version predominates. Obviously, you have issues of how you resolve disputes. Whose country you're going to do it in. One of the ways you might do that is what is called pendulum arbitration. If I sue you, I have to sue you in your country. If you sue me in my country. That's one way that gets resolved. Another way is often it's arbitration through either the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris or the WIPO rules. Those are some of the issues, the choice of law. But, by and large, you need to be sensitive to domestic laws. Obviously, you don't need a US manufacturer requirement. If you're licensing something into India, that's just a Bayh-Dole requirement, and other countries may have their own legal requirements for various reasons.
Yeah, and regarding the choice of law, you could also choose a third party besides two countries you're from the licensee and licensor from, isn't it?
So I've seen New York law used New York state law used a lot of times. Obviously, for patents, it'll be the national patent laws. But for other than patent matters, then New York law is very frequently used.
There are occasions when British law is used between, say, Indian and US partners as well. So that I've also seen happening. There's a question from M.A. Ganapati. If technology transfer happens before a patent is granted and the patent is ultimately not granted after patent prosecution, what will happen next?
So, you normally define a valid claim as an issued claim or a claim that's been pending for some negotiated number of years, so 7 years. And if your product gets launched within that 7-year period, then you would get the patent protected royalties. If there is a know-how provision with a lower royalty rate, if the patent doesn't issue, but they have used your know-how to develop the product, then the royalty rate would go down to the lower know-how rate.
You're going to have a staged kind of royalty slabs depending upon what happens, isn't it?
You can do that. When I got to BU, there was a license agreement that had been done that said, I think you pay 0.5% while the patents are pending and 1.5% after the patent's issued. And we didn't actually have any mechanism to track that. And somebody came in and volunteered to go through all my license agreements. And he found this license agreement and he looked up the patent application and found that it issued and we hadn't been aware of it. So we wrote to the company and said, hey, this issued, 6 years ago. So you owe us this amount of money for that 6-year period. And the company said, yep, we agree. We can't afford to pay you all right now. We'll pay you in, I think, 2 annual installments or something like that. And they did.
Niranjan has a question about future IP, especially after the licenses, signed. If both the licensee and the licensor are pursuing IP, how is that dealt with?
Well, you're certainly going to expect that the licensee will get their own IP as in the process of doing the development, but they're building on your fundamental. So if you've agreed that if a product based on your technology gets to the marketplace, it's worth 2% of sales, then it's worth 2% of sales.
Another question from Shamal Bose. How do we convince a university to seriously consider starting an in-house TTO in a country like India where enforcement of patents is a bigger issue, especially regional universities? You've had experiences in other countries. Ashley, what would be your pitch to university leadership to create a TTO?
Well, I think you want to look for some examples. The closer you to home you can get your examples, the better. I think the Better World report that John Fraser was talking about yesterday, this collection of stories of successful technology commercialization, certainly has a lot of examples from emerging economies. You need to be creative. The University of Novi Sad in Serbia, their professors would create consulting companies and gain rights to the technology and would then go to companies and say, look, here's the IP, we can help you develop it, and the revenues flow to us. And that has been very successful. A couple of those companies have gone on to get really substantial employment. There's one automotive one that has an employment of 5,000 people. In Serbia, that's a lot of impact. The University of Colombo, they took some know-how ideas the faculty had, created products, actually launched companies to sell those products, and the revenue flow back to the university was used to fund a tech transfer office. So sometimes you just have to get creative. In India,
Yeah.
we've had this example of the World Bank funding a network of 7 regional tech transfer offices that's serving all the regions of India.
And I think we're going to hear more from John on Thursday, which will focus a little bit more on how do you communicate the impact to your stakeholders effectively. And as you know, it's quite important to understand that at the end of the day, TTOs are delivery mechanisms for impact, and that is something which I think is something which all university leadership does understand, that they have to deliver impact at the end of it. I'll just go to the last question, Ashley, because I have to, I don't want to continue too long. But Anand Sivraj has a question. How do TTOs evaluate a technology based on invention disclosures? Is it good to involve the researcher during the process? Any best practices to keep aside subjectivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need, and I think Dick Cahoon will be talking about this, but every tech transfer office needs to have a invention evaluation protocol. I call mine the first look technology assessment. Dick calls his the 10-point technology scoring template. And you basically look at market issues, development issues, protection issues, competition issues. You have a standard template you go through and a scoring system, and you apply that rigidly, consistently from invention to invention. Before you come to any conclusions, you share it with the inventor to say, hey, here's what I found. You know, did I understand the application, the value correctly? You know, you give them a chance to dispute your findings. If they can't dispute your findings, then they have to buy into what you've decided to do or not do.
Yeah. I think with that, Ashley, I think we'll come to the end of this session. I have a lot of questions myself, which I've collected for you, but I think we had so many questions from the audience that it's taken up all the time. So I'll reserve my questions for when we meet again in June, and I'll throw those at you at that time. So with that, I'll hand over to Pragnya, who will take it ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Premnath. I thank Dr. Ashley Stevens for this enriching and wonderful session on technology licensing. And I think this has whetted the appetite of our participants to, apply for the in-person course, which is planned in June. Thanks a lot for this session. Thanks to all participants who participated in the quiz. We are looking forward to have you all tomorrow as well. Tomorrow we are having Dr. Richard Cahoon, who will be talking more about functions and activities of TTO, building and operating an effective TTO. So stay tuned. See you all tomorrow at the same time, 5:30 p.m. With this, we would close for today. Thank you.